And here is the huge problem with Dexcom G7. 4 months ago I inserted my first Dexcom G7 sensor, and since then I used more than 10 of them. So is the Dexcom G7 continuous glucose monitor really worth the hype? Let's find out. By the way, I'm not getting paid for making these videos. The Dexcom G7 system consists of 2 parts. This small low-profile sensor that you place on your upper arm and a receiving device where you can monitor your glucose values and trends. Dexcom's management likes to brag about the fact that the G7 sensor is 60% smaller than the G6, its predecessor. And to be honest, this is something I really love because the G7 is so much more discreet and less annoying to wear compared to its older brother. The G7 doesn't get in the way as much as the G6 did when I put on or take off my clothes. The G7 packaging and the sensor applicator are a lot smaller too. So when we think about the amount of plastic used, the production process has gotten a lot more environmental friendly. Another positive point for Dexcom. Now on the other hand, we all know that there are even smaller and sleeker sensors on the market, like the Freestyle Libre 3. So there is still a room for improvement for Dexcom when it comes to the form factor. One thing I like a lot is the G7 sensor applicator. It not only has a premium look, but it also makes it super easy to apply the sensor. You simply unscrew the cap, press and hold the applicator against your skin and push this button here. When you push the button, the sensor filament gets inserted under your skin. Then you simply remove the applicator and secure the sensor by rubbing around the patch 3 times and gently pressing on top of the sensor for 10 seconds. The G7 is an all-in-one sensor, which means that the transmitter that sends the data to the receiver or to your phone is integrated as part of the sensor. And that's the main reason why the application process is so much easier than it was with the Dexcom G6. But it also means that the sensor cannot be separated from the transmitter and cannot be restarted. But more about that later in this video. Now here is the problem I have with the Dexcom G7 sensors. They don't really stay on very well. They're supposed to last for 10 days, but the adhesive starts peeling off much earlier. The truth is that Dexcom gives us an overlay patch in the G7 package which might solve the problem for many people. But still, I'm a bit disappointed how easily Dexcom G7 peels off. The adhesive contact area is really small and it's really easy to knock the sensor off. If you bump into a door handle, if you're not careful while taking off your clothes, or even when you turn in your sleep. So Dexcom, work on the adhesive, make it stick better please. Now many of you wanted to know about the G7 filament, which is the tiny part of the sensor that goes under your skin and reads the glucose data from the interstitial fluid. Well, it looks like this. It's a bit shorter than the G6 filament and it goes in under a 90-degree angle, which is another slight change from the G6 that came in under a 45-degree angle. But honestly, to me personally, the G7 filament doesn't feel any different under my skin compared to the G6. You don't really feel it. Now here is one thing about the Dexcom G7 which is absolutely amazing. There is a little magnet in the sensor applicator and there is a similar little magnet in the sensor itself. When you press the button and apply the sensor, these magnets get separated. And as soon as they get separated, a 30-minute warm-up countdown starts automatically. Dexcom G6 had a warm-up period of 2 hours. After you applied the G6 sensor and transmitter, you had to manually start the sensor in the phone app and to wait 2 hours to get your first blood glucose reading. With the G7, everything happens automatically. You don't have to start the sensor in the app. And the G7 warm-up period is 4 times shorter, not 2 hours, but 30 minutes. But in real life, it actually feels even shorter than that because of the automated startup. Now the main reason why I always hated the long warm-up period on the G6 was that I didn't get blood glucose readings during that time and it always caused a gap in my glucose graph. With Dexcom G7 you can completely avoid the gap and I will show you how to do it here in a minute. Here is another fun fact about the G7. Although the wear time of the sensor is still only 10 days, G7 gets an extra 12-hour grace period. This means that after you've used your G7 sensor for 10 days, you can keep using it for another 12 hours before it completely stops. And that's great because it allows you to be more flexible when it comes to the site change. If your G7 expires in the middle of the night, you don't need to change the site right away. You can do it in the morning. But technically the G7 wear time is still only 10 or 10.5 days. What happened to the plan to increase the wear time to 14 days, Dexcom? Is the grace period just a marketing trick to make us forget about the promised 14-day wear time? I feel like it kinda is, but at the same time, I trust that Dexcom is still working on those 14 days. The grace period is more than just a marketing trick. It allows you to do 2 more things that are really cool. With Dexcom G7, you can completely avoid the gap in your graph. You can apply a new G7 sensor half an hour before the grace period on your current sensor ends. The 30-minute warm-up countdown will start on its own, and the new sensor will warm up while you are still receiving the glucose readings from from the old sensor. Now when you stop receiving the readings from the old sensor, you just switch to the new sensor in the app. If you do that, there will be no gap in your graph. And I absolutely love that because the G7 no longer keeps me in the dark. I have the blood glucose information available non-stop, even during a site change. That's amazing. Did you ever run into a problem with Dexcom G6 and your readings being terribly off during the first several hours after you apply the new sensor? This happens to me all the time. I simply can't rely on a new G6 sensor during the first several hours. With the G7 I can apply a new sensor when the 12-hour grace period on the old sensor starts. And only after those 12 hours I can switch to the new sensor, which is already warmed up and settled, because it had those 12 hours to do that. And when I do that, the readings are always on point right from the beginning. Before we talk about another major improvement to Dexcom G7, I just want to remind you that you can talk to me directly anytime on Patreon. If you have any specific questions, you can use the direct messaging option, which all my patrons get as one of the perks. We also do monthly community calls, and I share some other bonus content there. So if you want to chat or you just want to support my channel, sign up at patreon.com/type1talks. Another thing that is supposed to be super cool about Dexcom G7 is that you can not only view your glucose information and graph on your dedicated G7 receiver and in the mobile phone app, you should also be able to view your glucose information on your insulin pump or on your Apple Watch without your phone being around. The data will be sent directly from the G7 to the Apple Watch app. The G7 is designed to be paired with up to 3 devices, but at this point in time the direct to Apple Watch doesn't work just yet, so I can't really say anything about it. And unfortunately the same goes for all the insulin pumps. The only thing I know are the estimated G7 integration dates for Tandem and Omnipod pump users, which those companies gave out, and you can see them on the screen right now. So if you're someone like me who had been using a hybrid closed loop system and semi-automated insulin delivery, you might want to hold off on the transition from the G6 to the G7 until these integrations are in place. Now if you're an Android user, I feel your pain as well. I know how frustrating it is for you anytime the system gets updated or anytime you buy a new phone, but I have a simple advice for you. Get an iPhone. Now I'm sure you want to know if the G7 has been accurate for me. So I'm going to show you a few photos where you can compare my G7 readings to glucometer readings and see for yourself. By the way, I was wearing the sensor on my arm and the readings have been pretty accurate for the whole time. When I compared the G7's accuracy to Dexcom G6, I didn't really see any major improvements. Now if we want to assess the accuracy of Dexcom G7 using a more scientific approach, we need to look at the results of the clinical studies on larger groups of users. In these studies, Dexcom G7 achieved a mean absolute relative difference of 8.2% on the arm and 9.1% on the abdomen, which again is fairly comparable with the G6, which already had accuracy in the 9% ballpark. From my experience, the G7 readings are still slightly lagging behind blood readings, which is logical because the sensor takes the readings from the interstitial fluid, not from blood. The lag time should have slightly improved with the G7 to approximately 3.5 minutes, but in real life, I didn't really see any difference when I compare my experience with the G6. Now some of you ask me if you can still calibrate the G7 readings within the app to your actual blood readings, and the answer is yes, you can still do that if you want to. I personally didn't have to do that a lot because, as I said, my readings were fairly accurate. Now before we talk about the Dexcom G7 availability in different countries, we need to talk about some major improvements that Dexcom made to the G7 app. The phone and the watch app have been fully redesigned and got the new look, very modern with some new user-friendly features. It's actually a very nice app, which I think I never said about any CGM app before. So good job, Dexcom. The app now has both real-time data about your glucose and historical data, which were only available in the Clarity app earlier. You will probably spend 99% of your time in the app on the glucose tab, where you can see your glucose graph and glucose value, and you have quick access to everything important. Click these 3 dots here and you can quickly readjust your alarm levels or completely silence the alarms for a certain amount of time. Now I think having this quick access to readjusting the alarms or completely silencing the alarms for a certain time is a great feature. When I know I'm high and I really don't want alarms to repeatedly alert me about that in the next couple hours, I should have the option to turn it off. And the G7 gives me this option, unlike many other medical devices. Now I heard that this option will not be available in the US at launch. The FDA didn't like it, but hopefully Dexcom will be able to put it in later on in the future. Another thing I really like about the G7 app is that you can have two separate sets of alarm and switch between them whenever you want. You can set alarms differently for the time you are at work and for the time you are at home, if that's what you want to do. All these little improvements Dexcom made huge impact from the mental health perspective. We really need more control over the alerts and alarms. We should be the ones to decide when we want to use these features and when not. And Dexcom G7 really gives us more control. Another great example of this is that you can delay your first high alarm for a certain amount of time by default, which is something I talked about in my previous video. Now, if you're a parent being concerned with your child having too much control, I understand, but don't worry, because the Follow app still works and you can monitor your loved ones remotely using the Follow app. Now let's talk about how much the G7 will cost you, because if you're paying out of pocket, these bad boys are not cheap. A 30-day supply of the G7 sensors in the UK, for example, comes to over £150 or $190. And here is the huge problem with Dexcom G7. Remember on the G6 there was this public secret that everyone knew about. Yes, I'm talking about restarting the sensors. Whenever your G6 expires, you can basically go ahead, restart the sensor and get an extra 10 days out of it. You could even do it repeatedly. And Dexcom has never disabled this option. You can still do it with the G6. Although it's something I can't recommend you to do. But guess what? There is no such thing with the G7. You cannot restart the sensor. When the grace period ends, you're done. No more readings for you. And this might be a big deal for a lot of people. Now, one question you are always asking me is when the G7 will be available in my country. Here is where Dexcom G7 is already available. On top of these countries, the G7 will be launched in the United States probably in March 2023. Now, I totally understand that you might be disappointed if your country is not yet on the list. But keep in mind that the new shiny CGM like the Dexcom G7 is just one of the tools in your toolbox on your way to perfect blood sugars. Any other CGM will get you there too. And there is one thing that reduces blood sugar more effectively than anything else. So don't ignore this video and click here to find out what this thing is. I will see you there. Thanks for watching. Ciao.